Randy, I want to thank you for describing my thought process this last week. I felt very much like I should go and say to somebody, what is this about, please? I want to begin today by setting a scene for you. I want us to see it in our mind's eye. It's the scene for the scripture reading you just heard. At the very beginning of Matthew 13, Jesus is on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And as usual, when people hear that he's there, this huge crowd throngs to the shoreline, so many of them, that Jesus finally had to get in a little boat and row some yards out so that everyone could see and hear him. Fortunately, voices travel well over the water. And so I want to finally give this sermon a title. It's Jesus Sitting in a Boat, talking about the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven, the idea of God reigning on earth, is the central theme of Jesus' ministry. It's how he begins it. He says, he begins his ministry by saying, the kingdom of God is at hand. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. And on this day, as he usually does with the crowds, he chooses to explain it in parables. You heard 3 of them. The kingdom of heaven is like a field planted with wheat, and then an enemy overplants with tares. The kingdom is like a mustard seed. The kingdom is like leaven which a woman adds to flour. Well, that clears it up, doesn't it? Maybe it's just me, but my other name for this scene is Jesus sitting in a boat talking in riddles. Maybe the meaning of these parables was obvious to the throngs of Jewish peasants who came to listen to Jesus, but 2,000 years later, I think something is lost in translation. So I did what any reasonable sermon writer would do, and I started reading commentaries on these parables. And the problem I had was pretty simple. There's lots of commentaries on these parables. But most of the commentators have made these parables into complex or simple, sometimes allegories that speak of the growth of the Christian church. For example, the wheat plants are the good Christians and the tares are obviously not the good Christians, and so God will sort it out at the final judgment, and so on and so forth. Now I want to be fair. Parables are intended to be interpreted and reinterpreted by successive audiences. But I also think that to genuinely contemplate what Jesus meant and how it applies to us, I actually think it might be best to start by trying to understand what his first century Jewish audience might have heard. And I am confident of this one thing. They did not hear allegories about a then unimagined and non-existent Christian church. This is not what ran through their head. So back to our scene. The crowd on the shore that morning, as I said, is like all his crowds, made up of people actually not unlike him, poor Jewish peasants who lived under the oppressive thumbs of Rome and King Herod. The truth was that there wasn't much hope for their lives unless you count the hopes like, I hope my children don't starve. So what did the phrase kingdom of heaven conjure up for them? Well, for starters at least, I think that their dreams of the kingdom of heaven were the same as the messianic dreams for just about every Jew. A powerful ruler would emerge, a new King David, and this king would throw off the yoke of Rome with overwhelming force, and everything would finally be okay. And this is where it gets weird, I think, because Jesus' words are in that context truly puzzling. He is saying that the kingdom is coming, that it is at hand, even that it is already here, but he weirdly refuses to talk about power, and he certainly doesn't talk about violence. Instead, he talks about little commonplace things much more familiar to them than to us. Let's start with that field with the wheat. The field is planted with wheat, but an enemy comes at night and sows tares. Oh, they got that one, because tares is something quite specific. Tares are the darnel weed, and as they grow, they look exactly like wheat until the very end of the growing cycle when they bear no fruit. Almost impossible to tell apart. And these weeds mixed with wheat is so devastating that there was actually a crime under Roman law to throw tares into a person's field. Now I'm guessing that those peasants probably did make the leap that there's a metaphor going on here. Okay, so we're the wheat, and we certainly know who the tares are. It's those Romans and those Jewish collaborators with the Romans, the tax collectors, and the priestly elite in Jerusalem, and always, always, always the greedy landlords. They are most certainly tares. And so what Jesus suggests here, though, if you're going with that metaphor, is really shocking. He doesn't suggest a violent uprooting of the tares. He makes them think about that because, see, that would damage the wheat. And it's certainly not a burn it all down approach. Surely, if they're playing with a metaphor, they can see that burning it all down destroys them, too. So maybe Jesus is pushing them to think a little bit more. See, the thing is, one can never be sure who is a wheat plant and who is a tare. Goodness knows the Romans would say that the gathered crowd are the tares. And so the deal is this: patience and humility are the required virtues. Now, this is not a very satisfying response to dreams of freedom, and it's not at all a response to dreams of revenge. It is instead a call to live and grow in God's realm as if you are the wheat. Because if you do live that way, then you are the wheat. A useful metaphor for us, yes? We know who the tares of our time are, don't we? We're quite sure about that. And if the worst of all of them disappeared tomorrow, or at least had the decency to sit down and be quiet, we would rejoice. But isn't Jesus saying something else? Not tend to the tares. He's saying tend to the wheat. Live, grow. And yes, sometimes it will be very difficult because tares are tares, but that's part of life on earth. Just live your life as if it were taking place in the kingdom of heaven, because weirdly enough, then it is taking place in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus then continues with that one-line parable about the tiny mustard seed. And I always think the crowd got a good chuckle out of this. Nobody in their right mind would deliberately plant a mustard seed, at least not without a number of precautions about containing it. It was a useful plant, to be sure. There were considerable numbers of medicinal uses for it, and they already used it for food. But it actually didn't need much help getting planted. The mustard bush was an annual. It sprang up during the rains of winter, quickly grew to 6 feet, sometimes 10, and then it died when the heat came. But when it died, it spread its tiny seeds everywhere, and so, of course, it came back with a vengeance. To call it a tree, however, a tree, that was a chuckle too. If this was supposed to be the symbol of God's kingdom, then it was a pretty pathetic sign of power. The great kingdoms were usually likened to mighty cedar trees. But Jesus insisted that they notice that this humble, more or less indestructible bush harbored life. The birds of the air, he says. And he could have added the little creatures that huddled under its branches. He seems to be saying this: your own lives might seem so humble that you are scarcely noticed. You are seen by the world as nothing more than weeds. God doesn't see it that way. If you harbor and protect life as best you can, you are mighty. That speaks to us as well, I think. I've sat in countless group discussions where members of this church, myself included, have bemoaned the fact that our efforts can seem so meager. The loud spectacle of our culture, all the flash, all the noise, seems to belong to those who either proclaim the glories of bottomless consumption or to those who vent their spleen in ways that suck up most of the air of media attention. In our own time, it turns out hate will get you a lot of social media clicks. So maybe it's important to remember the tenacity of those lowly mustard bushes. They just kept coming back, and they just kept harboring life. And then Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman hides. He says hides. I find that very affecting. Leaven that woman hides in 3 measures of flour. Now they knew about leaven, at least the women knew about leaven. Every home had some. It was what we would call sourdough starter. There's not cultured yeast yet, obviously. And I think what really got their attention, though, in this story was that she's putting it in 3 measures of flour. Now, our ears hear 3 measures of flour. Oh, that's probably 3 cups of flour. Nope. 3 measures was called an ephah, and it was over a bushel of flour, about 50 pounds. The kingdom of heaven is likened to leaven that will make wonderful bread, and in this case, make wonderful bread to feed 100 people, a whole village. There is joy in this parable preached to hungry people. The kingdom of heaven promises a feast for all. But Jesus' listeners would have also understood that this meant work. At least the women would get this one. To mix that much dough makes my arms ache thinking about it. To knead it, to bake all the loaves, not burn them, enough to feed the village. That was no easy task. But I also think those women listened and thought, but what a glorious work that would be if we had that much flour. Jesus, sitting in a boat, is telling the crowd that the kingdom is all around them, hidden in plain sight. God is right in front of their noses. So, maybe we can understand the power these parables had for his listeners. Maybe we can even feel that power. But I still think we're missing something. And it's the first question, the one that I always want the answer to. We've talked about this in Tuesday book group. Why were these crowds full of the destitute, the outcast, the beaten down, why were they longing to listen to this? Why were they running to be part of the crowd surrounding Jesus? Why is it that they wouldn't leave him alone? He and his parables didn't promise them that the Romans would leave. He certainly didn't promise that life would become easy. What these crowds sense, I think, what we can sense if we pay attention, is that the kingdom Jesus promised was what Professor Wendy Farley calls the kingdom of divine presence. God with you, all around you. And I also think that the crowd saw the nearness of that presence in Jesus himself. I need to share with you how Professor Farley describes Jesus, because I honestly don't think her words can be improved. She says that what showed in Jesus was that he was intoxicated with the divine presence. And then she says, he walks in paradise wherever he is. Dusty and hungry, he travels country roads where peasants have been dislocated by imperial economics, where fishermen are losing their livelihood, where artisans like his own father are driven from poverty to desperation, and women suffer the predations of a society dissolving into military rule. Here, amid this suffering, horror, confusion, Jesus roams, a light, a radiance. Crowds follow him everywhere. He touches them, he feeds them, and he tries to find words that let them share the inebriation in which he dwells. God is with us. And that is the kingdom he invites them to. Us too. And so, I think there might be one more lesson here. We know that the kingdom of heaven must be about social justice. But I think the kingdom is also, and maybe first, about something else. It is about the joy of a journey knowing we are accompanied by God, the joy of community that comes from walking together, each person valued. That's what is meant by the beloved community. That's the kingdom of heaven, right here on earth. A few weeks back, there was this little moment here in this sanctuary, and I couldn't keep it from running through my head this week. It was a few minutes before the service. Kayla and I were sitting there. And then Etienne, one of our resident toddlers, escaped from his mother Carol in the very back of the church, and he took off crawling. I mean, crawling. I looked up just in time to see him going full toddler speed down the center aisle. And there he was quickly joined by a 6-year-old crawling with him, and then another one. And those two were laughing uncontrollably, laughing in pure delight at the race, which they were clearly losing to Etienne. And every face in this sanctuary was lit up. It was an unexpected and uncomplicated moment of joy. And so, one more parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a toddler racing on his knees down the center aisle, accompanied by 2 laughing 6-year-olds and surrounded by enchanted